As you know, that in the last 3 years, we have been fortunate to bring in a blend of speakers, the best minds that we could get and that the profession has from India and abroad. We have had the privilege of having two Nobel laureates come and speak to us on contemporary issues. It is in that very context that we have invited, and we are fortunate that Marcos agreed. We have invited Marcos from the IMF Fiscal Department to come and speak to us about the most recent fiscal monitor that has been just released. The importance of this fiscal monitor is that Marcos and his team at the IMF are propounding a theory which is slightly different version of the earlier theories, the new theory about can the deficits influence inflation. In our own country, there have been scholars who feel yes and who feel not at all. And therefore, because this debate is so important and so refreshing, we wanted him to come and present his thoughts with us at our forum. He kindly agreed. So, to chair this session, we have Professor Ashima Goyal. Professor Ashima Goyal actually is such a well-known name. She doesn't need an introduction. She is our advisor at EGROW Foundation. She has been in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. She is right now on the RBI's Monetary Policy Committee. In the past, she has provided consultancy to Asian Development Bank, UNDP, UNSCAP, and the World Bank. She is actively involved in public policy debate in our country and a very respected figure in that sense. She has been editing the Rowley Journal in Macroeconomics and Finance for a very long time. She has published extensively in referee journals, number of articles there. She has also authored and edited a number of books, including the Macroeconomics and Markets in Developing and Emerging Economies. And my favorite book that she has done is a concise handbook of the Indian economy in the 21st century. I think that's a collector's item, and every economist in our country probably has that copy on their desk. The speaker today, as I just mentioned, is Marcos. Marcos is the Deputy Division Chief in the IMF's Fiscal Policy and Surveillance Division of the Fiscal Affairs Department. He has previously held positions in the IMF's Research, Fiscal Affairs, and African departments, including as the IMF's resident representative in Gabon from 2017 to 2021. He has published in leading academic and policy-oriented journals on several topics in the field of public finance, macro, international economics, and development. Marcos holds a PhD in economics from the University of Amsterdam. With this, I hand over the session to Professor Goyal to conduct the proceedings further. Thank you.
Thank you, Charan, for a very kind introduction. Marcos, we look forward to hearing you. It's a very important topic, very, very topical. We've seen large fiscal deficits after COVID-19, and then we've seen a spurt of inflation, mostly in advanced economies, more severely in advanced economies.
Correct.
So I think there's a lot to understand and debate over there. We look forward to hearing from you. You could maybe take about 40 minutes and then we can have some discussion. Huh?
Perfect. I will do so. So, first of all, thank you so much, Mr. Singh. Thank you so much, Madam Goyal. Thanks so much, the EGROW group, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, I'm virtually. I would love to be present there in India. Also a big pleasure to be, in such a distinguished panel with like such distinguished discussants and group and attendees. So it's really a pleasure. So as Mr. Singh, Madam Goyal was saying, I will be presenting today our chapter 2, our analytical chapter of the last April 2023 fiscal monitor. As you know, the IMF, every semester surrounding its meetings with the World Bank, published 3 flagships: the fiscal monitor, the World Economic Outlook, and the Global Financial Stability Report. And we have an analytical chapter normally in each one, at least one in each one of these flagships. So I have to say before I start that even though the chapter is IMF, of course the views expressed in this discussion we're going to have is my own views, and so using the disclaimer. So when we were thinking about writing the chapter, the analytical chapter for this April fiscal monitor, we one of the questions that came to us is we have to write something about public finance and inflation. And why writing about public finance and inflation? Because we believe that public finance and inflation have an intertwined relationship between the two of them. On one hand, inflation and inflationary shocks may impact fiscal policy. So think about indexation of public wages, think about indexation of social spending programs. On the other hand, public finance and government spending and fiscal deficits, they add to the aggregate demand, and in that sense they may actually lead to inflationary pressures. So we thought that it would be important to study this intertwined relationship in such a current moment where we see the largest upsurge in inflation across the world, particularly in advanced economies, but also in large emerging economies such as Brazil, for the last 30 to 40 years, at least in advanced economies. So the way we did in the chapter, we actually raised 3 questions that we try to address through analytical work in the chapter. So first, how does inflation affect fiscal accounts? So how do the effects of depend on institutional features such as indexation to affect of inflationary shocks affecting public finance? So this side of the causality. Second, how large are the distributive effects of inflation across households in countries at different levels of economic and financial development? And third, what is the role of fiscal policy in the efforts to promote price stability? So looking at the other side of the causality where fiscal policy could affect public finances. So going to the first question, we basically thought in summarizing, and we start the chapter in that way, with a summary of the main channels through which, theoretical channels through which inflation can affect public finances in the short term, at least from a conceptual way. And we summarize that in our executive summary through this infographic that shows, again, the main drivers or the main mechanisms through which inflation affect public finance. And those main drivers are 4 that you can see in this first row in this infographic. So the first, as you can imagine, inflation affects boosts the nominal GDP, or the nominal GDP tends to grow in line with inflation, as well as the tax base. So that's if you have the denominator, nominal GDP growing with inflation, that may affect your fiscal variables that are in ratios to GDP, which is one of our main indicators for fiscal policy. The second one, as I mentioned in the introduction, is indexation. So you have several variables indexed to inflation. Some countries do. We are going to discuss that in a second, and that may affect an inflationary shock through this indexation may automatically affect public finances. The third is the structure of the sovereign debt, right? So depending on the maturity of the sovereign debt, if it's short term, if it's long term, depending on how the composition of the of the sovereign debt, if it's foreign currency denominated, if it's domestic debt, if our debt linked to bonds, the bonds linked to inflation, as is very common, for example, in the UK, then you have like linked bonds to inflation. Inflation goes up, immediately the price of these bonds will change connected to their relationship or their indexation to inflation. And then we have market expectations. Inflationary shock hits, markets, integrate that in their forecasts for the conjuncture and for the price of bonds, and that may lead to automatic effects on the price of bonds, which may drive public finance and the cost of financing for the government. So, so these are the four main items. I'm not going to go in detail given the 40 minutes that I have for the presentation, but our chapter basically discusses in detail each one of these drivers. Okay. Then, in trying to answer this question about like how inflation affects public finances, we thought indexation is a very important institutional factor for governments. So we actually like try to make a survey of like what are the current indexation practices around the world. So we first went to several documents of international institutions to try to understand for each country in the world what is the indexation to inflation situation for four variables: the personal income tax bracket, the pension indexation, indexation to inflation of social assistance programs, and indexation of public wages. So we go to these documents, and then beyond that, for the IMF, as you know, has a country team for each one of its own members. So we ask the 179 members of the IMF, the country teams of these 179 members, what is the current status of indexation in the country you cover? And we got answers for at least 116 to at most 176 countries on these four variables. And the results you see in this, summarizing this chart. So basically, the pink components of the bar is there is no indexation. And our main conclusions from this survey is actually like indexation varies significantly across countries. Indexation varies significantly across groups of countries between advanced economies, emerging markets, and low-income countries. But we can say that like advanced economies, as you can see from the other colors in the bars, tend to have more indexation than emerging markets and low-income countries. And this indexation is more prevalent in pensions. So pension systems in advanced economies tend to have like a large share of countries with like some sort of indexation, either to inflation or to the minimum wage, for example. So that's what we can see in the second left-hand side chart. And beyond pension indexation, the other item that sees a lot of indexation to inflation is social assistance programs. So in 50% of advanced economies, as the green bar shows, you have like the majority of their social assistance programs indexed to inflation. So if inflation goes up, the benefits of the social assistance programs will go up as well. Surprising, public wages have less indexation than we initially expected, right? And we see a little bit more in emerging markets, around 30% of the countries we cover with like some sort of indexation, but much lower than we expected. Now, as inflation continues in these economies, as inflation becomes persistent, this may change, and that's like one of concerns and one of the risks we raise in our chapter, because this indexation to inflation may have like, it has a trade-off. It has a trade-off in terms of like, you do want like civil servants to have like, some compensation for the increase in inflation. Otherwise, their real wages go down, and you wanna that to retain quality. You wanna that to increase productivity in the public sector. But on the other hand, given the size of the public sector in many countries, this may lead to a wage growth spiral. This may lead to a more persistent inflation. So governments have to decide on this trade-off on whether and how much to index to inflation public wages. Then the final question, the final analysis on this section, or this first question, is an econometric analysis where we try to understand how inflationary shock affects public finance. So we look at 85 countries for I'm not showing here the result, but starting from 1962 to 2019, and we identify the shock, inflationary shock, and when we ask the data, does that inflationary shock lead to lower debt or to lower deficits? And the answer is yes. We found that on average, a decline in or an increase in 1 percentage point of inflation leads to a decline of around 0.6 percentage points of GDP on public debt for 85 countries since 1962. So we were quite surprised by this result. So we actually investigated further, and we make the question that we are showing on these slides. Okay, given that inflationary shocks lead to a reduction in debt over the medium term, is this caused by expected inflation or by unexpected inflation, by inflation surprise? And the results here in this slide show that actually most of the reduction in debt caused by inflationary shocks is due to unexpected or surprising inflation. So inflation that was not expected hits the economy, and that has two effects. I'm going to discuss one of them in the next slide. The first, as I said, the nominal GDP goes up in line with inflation. So if you are looking at debt ratios to GDP, immediately the denominator goes up because inflation is going up. Now, we also find that this surprising inflation leads revenues, for that matter, also goes up automatically with inflation. The tax base grows in nominal terms. You pay VAT, for example, on products that their prices are increasing, so you pay more VAT automatically. Now, what we also find is actually there is a decline, a temporary decline in primary deficits caused by this inflationary shock. And that's due to the stickiness of spending. Spending normally is set up in budgets, in national budgets, in nominal terms. So if an inflationary shock, a surprise inflationary shock hits the economy throughout a year, there is already a budget in place in nominal terms, in rupees. So that nominal term, that budget target becomes actually a ceiling in nominal terms. So you have a decline in real terms of the level of spending. And those two effects, the denominator effect and the temporary reduction in deficits, causes for surprise inflation this reduction in public debt, which is particularly more prevalent for countries in which the debt over GDP is above 50%, countries in which the public debt is high, right? For expected inflation, we do not see a significant effect of inflationary shock on inflation, so on public debt. So again, the recommendation here is that, or the conclusion here is surprise inflation may have a positive effect in terms of debt, but be aware that if this inflation persists and becomes expected, this positive effect on public debt may vanish, right? So here I'm showing exactly what I was saying about the effect on primary deficit or overall balance and primary balance, and the effect on primary expenditure. As we can see, when there is inflationary shock, and this analysis I'm now using quarterly data. For the previous chart I was using annual data. You see that once inflation hits the economy, primary expenditure as a percent of GDP goes down significantly in our econometric analysis. So that leads to improvement temporarily in the overall balance, which is one of the channels through which the surprising inflation leads to a reduction in the public debt. Then, so that's the first part, that's the first question. The second question about the distributive effects of inflation, we then try to analyze the three channels that we think are relevant for households' well-being and for households' income distribution. The first one is a classical one that we all expected. Inflation may affect the household's consumption baskets. Think about like if the price of foods goes up by more than the average inflation, and I'm a household that consumes more food, then I'm gonna be hit by inflation relatively more than the average households. The second channel is the impact of inflation on households' real income, or the income channel. So connected to the discussion I had on indexation, think about if my wages are indexed to inflation or not, are adjusted to inflation or not. I may have like a negative or a neutral or even a positive effect of inflation if my wage is adjusted by more than inflation. And these may differ across households. Third, the impact of inflation may also occur through the household's balance sheet. So the household's initial assets and liabilities. And I will explain this wealth channel more in detail in a second. So for that analysis, we go to microdata for the period of mid-2021 to mid-2022. We collect household surveys and several other microdata sets for 6 countries: Colombia, Finland, France, Kenya, Mexico, and Senegal. These are economies, like 2 of them are advanced economies, 2 emerging markets, and 2 low-income countries. And then we try to, like, with this microdata, simulate the effect of the observed inflation in mid-2021 to mid-2022. What we find going to the different channels is like, if you look at the household consumption basket, these charts will show you the household specific inflation for 3 countries: Kenya, Colombia, and Finland. So here in the x-axis, I have like the different income quantiles, households' income quantiles from the poorest to the richest. And the red dashed line is the average inflation observed in the economy. And what we can see is actually like, first of all, this consumption basket channel effect, or this household specific inflation, declines for low-income countries and emerging market economies as the household becomes richer. So the effect is larger for poorest households than for richest households. This is flat instead for advanced economies like Finland, right? So that's the first finding. Second finding is like for low-income countries where, you know, a lot of the households like consume mostly food. The food basket, or the food effect of inflation, is much more important than other items in the consumption basket of the household. So you see that the blue bar is much more important for the poor's 20% in Kenya, and for the poor's 20% in Colombia, than for their richest households in the same countries, right? Now, interesting, for Finland, for advanced economies, the blue part of the bar is much lower. So food prices is much less impactful in these economies, given that like the consumption basket of the household doesn't have like a large share in terms of food. However, energy price and energy consumption, as well as transportation consumption, which is connected to energy again, is much more important for households in Finland, and the same we found in France. So much more important in advanced economies than food. And you see that again, this is like the average effect is flat, while, you know, the composition between energy for housing and transportation changes across income quantiles. Then we go to the average, to the final, or to the summary of all the results in this section. and we find a couple of interesting facts. So first, the consumption channel, as I just showed for Kenya, is decaying across households and much more important for low-income households, and also much more important for Kenya than for, say, Finland, where you don't see almost the the red component of the bars. Now, what we see from these charts is the income channel, the fact that either wage, pensions, and other remunerations are or are not adjusted to inflation has a much bigger effect on the distributive effects of inflation to households than this consumption basket. So you can see here like Kenya, and by the way, they are mostly flat across the different quantiles in all three countries that we are plotting. So you can see the blue bar here in Kenya. You can see how large is the blue bar in Finland, the negative effect. So meaning that like in Finland, wage, pensions, and other remunerations were not adjusted one-to-one to inflation. So the households faced a loss in real terms to their remunerations. While in Colombia, an oil exporter, a commodity exporter, remunerations were adjusted by more than the inflation, so they had a positive effect, right? The final finding, which is quite interesting as well, of like this analysis, is on the wealth channel. And here we only had for Colombia and for advanced economies this information of balance sheets of households. And what we find is an inverted U-shape effect on the household's income and on the household income distribution for these advanced economies. Why this inverted U shape? Well, because we observe it that in terms of wealth channel, there is a redistribution from net lenders to net borrowers when inflation hits the economy. When the inflation hits the economy, think about if I'm a net borrower, if I have a mortgage or if I have other loans with banks, the value in nominal terms of those loans don't change. The interest rates most of the time is fixed, particularly in advanced economies for mortgages, right? So inflation hits, and all of a sudden that loan that I own to the bank is in real terms lower than used to be. And that's what we observe by this positive effect, wealth effect, in some of the quantile, the middle income quantiles for Finland, who in the middle income are net borrowers. For very rich households, net lenders, they have assets, and the effect of this balance sheet, or the effect of inflation on their balance sheet will depend on how these assets are adjusted to inflation. So if I have a housing, for example, properties, and the prices of those properties did not increase with inflation, I will have a negative effect in terms of wealth. And here we see a very marginal negative effect in Finland through this channel for the very rich households in Finland. For the poor households, the story is different, right? For poor households, most of the time they don't borrow much. They are not borrowers. They also don't have assets, of course, and the only assets they have is cash. And an inflationary shock hits the economy, you hold cash, all of a sudden you have a very negative effect through your assets being very depleted in real terms. So this is a interesting finding for the distributive effect. This redistribution of net lenders to net borrowers can also be observed across different age brackets. So it's connected to the life cycle. So younger households tend to be net borrowers. Older households tend to be net lenders. So what you observe in the data, and this chart is quite striking for Finland and France, for every single income quantile, so the colors of this figure shows the different income quantiles. For every single income quantile, we observe that younger households have a positive effect of the inflationary shock because they are net borrowers, while the older households for every single income quintile have a negative effect of the inflationary shock. Okay, so these are some interesting finds in terms of like the household income distribution. Finally, we go to the more policy loaded question: does fiscal policy affect inflation? So we do two different use two different methodologies to answer this question. First, we establish empirically the relationship between fiscal policy and inflation. We use that through a two econometric exercise, and then we do some modeling simulations to understand how fiscal policy then could help monetary policy in bringing inflation down, in bringing price stability back. So on the empirical side, we did two exercises, I was saying. The first exercise, we actually look at like a structural VAR using Valerie Ramey's identification strategy for fiscal multipliers. So there is an entire literature on fiscal multipliers that identify a fiscal shock, a pure fiscal shock on the economy. We use that identification strategy. We use actually the paper's data, and we just added to the structural VAR inflation. Valerie Ramey had not added inflation in the structural VAR. And what we find, as we could expect, the same values of fiscal multipliers to GDP, the same like results that she found it. But on inflation, we found a positive and significant effect of inflation a positive and significant effect of like government spending in the US on inflation. So here, after 3 to 4 quarters of like a spending shock, right? We observe that like inflation goes up in the US econometrically, statistically by around 0.5 percentage points. So again, a very significant effect that fiscal policy does lead to inflation. We also enlarged the sample for 18 advanced economies, and we use a sign restriction identification strategy to run a Bayesian VAR, asking the same question: does government spending affect like inflation? And we split the sample between 2 periods, so that's why you see red and blue lines. The red line looks at the sample from 1950 to 1985 in these 18 advanced economies, and the blue lines show the sample from 1986 to 2019. And what we find is like actually, if you focus on this chart on inflation, is that like in the period pre-1985, fiscal policy had a larger effect on inflation. Government, 1 percentage point of GDP government spending would lead to almost a 0.9, almost a 1 percentage point increase in inflation in the 18 advanced economies that we analyze. On the more and on the more recent periods, from 1986 to 2019, this effect is still statistically significant, and I would say is still relatively large. A 1 percentage point of GDP increase in government spending is associated with a 0.5 percentage points increase in inflation for 18 advanced economies in our econometric analysis, right? And this effect also lasts for around 4 to 5 years, right? Showing this significant and persistent effect of like a government spending, fiscal policy on inflation. So once we answer this question, and I'll finish my presentation in a second, we then try to look through a model how fiscal policy could support monetary policy in bringing inflation down. So we use a very new and frontier type of models, heterogeneous agents, New Keynesian models, these Hank models. The interesting feature for us of these Hank models is actually like now agents are heterogeneous, so all of a sudden in the model you have income distribution. So we can see how fiscal and monetary policies may affect macroeconomic aggregates in the model, but you can also see how these variables affect income distribution in the model, right? So here in this slide, I'm not going to spend too much time, but it's just to say that we are using the state-of-art Henk model for our analysis with the several assumptions that are used in the literature, okay? And then we do 3 exercises with this model. We say, well, suppose in all the 3 of them, suppose you start from a high inflation point, and then we ask 3 questions, or we do 3 simulations. Should we bring, or what are the effects of bringing inflation down through monetary policy only, through a very large shock on interest rates that would bring monetary policy up and inflation down? The second exercise, we say, what if we keep a Taylor rule, so we keep monetary policy active in bringing inflation down, but we support monetary policy with a fiscal consolidation, okay? And that fiscal consolidation doesn't have any particular composition. We basically are reducing current spending, right? The third exercise, we say, let's keep monetary policy active through a Taylor rule. Let's do this fiscal consolidation, but let's do this fiscal consolidation smartly, meaning that let's consolidate more current spending while we give transfers to the poor in the economy that are mostly affected by the inflationary shock. So we change the composition of the fiscal consolidation. And the results are shown in the next 2 slides. So this first slide shows the effect of a monetary policy only affecting inflation. What we see is we see a huge spike in interest rates. These real huge spike in interest rates do bring the red line inflation down, right? And does bring consumption as well down. So there is this a large effect on aggregate consumption, right? But the interesting feature of this monetary policy shock only is actually so the aggregate consumption or the recession because the economy is quite large and is larger for the poorest in the economy, so the red line, or the 10th percentile poorest, which is the brown line, than for the richest in the economy, which is this pink line. So the monetary policy shock only not only cause a large recession, cause a large fall in aggregate consumption to bring inflation down, but also increase income inequality, right? Then we go to the results with fiscal consolidation supporting monetary policy. And here, the first row shows inflation, the fiscal consolidation that's not target or untarget, so there is no transfers to the poor households. And the second row show a target fiscal tightening where, while I consolidate the overall fiscal deficits, I provide transfers to the poorest in the economy. And what we find is if you do an untarget fiscal tightening combined with monetary policy, again, a big recession, I bring inflation down, but I even increase even more the income inequality effect in the economy, with the poorest households being mostly affected in their consumption than the richest households, right? Now, if I do a target fiscal tightening, first of all, the consumption, the aggregate consumption, this blue line, is much smaller than in the other cases, so a much smaller effect on aggregate consumption, because given the transfers to the poorest, and given that the poorest have the largest marginal propensity to consume, you actually improve income inequality in the sense that the poorest households, the red line, actually consume more because they receive transfers, while the middle class and the richest economy, the richest households, they are more affected by this fiscal consolidation than the poorest. So I finish here. We learned several things in this chapter. Inflation shocks are associated with a fall in public debt over the medium term, but this is mostly connected to surprise inflation. So inflating that away is neither a desirable or a sustainable strategy. Indexation of budget items can preserve the real value of these items, but there is this trade-off between remunerating civil servants and keeping high quality, while if you excessively index public finances, you can make inflation more persistent. The redistributive effects of inflation households are more complex than usually thought. They do not only depend on the consumption basket of the households, but also on the income and the balance sheet of the households, with a redistribution from net lenders to net borrowers in the economies. And last, fiscal restraint can help monetary policy in bringing price stability back while protecting the most affected by the cost of living crisis. Okay, so I stop here and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Marcos. Very, very thorough. Number of different aspects the study chapter has examined. Now, I will just make a few comments based on the Indian experience largely, because in a way, India has come out of these poly shocks quite well. So, this is a very interesting finding, your first question, that only unexpected inflation improves the fiscal position. But that might be because in countries where there's more indexation of benefits, so that expected inflation, there is indexation, right? But in countries where there's less indexation, like in India, you would say that even expected inflation would have some effect on fiscal benefits. But at the same time, because there's less indexation, there tends to be a lot of political pressure on the government if there is inflation, to increase subsidies, etc. So, it's very often our Reserve Bank, for example, would justify tightening under inflation by saying that this helps the poor. Inflation hurts the poor. So this effect on household balance sheets also, that the poor tend to be more indebted. So when you say that inflation hurts the poor, but very often the poor have very many informal loans, so then they should be benefited by a fall in the real value of the debt. But that is not perceived that much. So it doesn't enter the political debate. Then your exercise on, the Valerie Ramy type of SVAR to take out the effect of fiscal policy on inflation. You went through it quite quickly, so the details of the empirical strategy. But what one hears about the US case, for example, for so long, the belief was among academics, among policymakers, that interest rates are so low, there's really a zero cost to government borrowing, that fiscal policy was underutilized during the global financial crisis. And that was one reason there was such a large fiscal stimulus during the COVID-19 pandemic. But, they'd forgotten about the supply side and supply shocks and their effect on inflation, because the pandemic had all those supply chain bottlenecks and all. So recently I've heard that for example, Ben Bernanke's position is that it was fiscal spending after the pandemic, that caused inflation. Otherwise, fiscal spending by itself. So do you control for this kind of thing, that when is a fiscal tightening, in your SWAR analysis? And also the type of government spending, because one thing we found in India is that the government, some targeted sort of transfers to the poor, but most of the spending and some relief on food and oil taxation. We have very high taxation on oil, which also directly reduced inflation. These are short-term effects on inflation, but then also the type of government spending was more investment, infrastructure, which tends to relieve the supply side and reduces inflation
Right.
in the long run, right?
Right.
So this composition of, for example, I think the Biden stimulus, when it was just checks to people and they were spending
Right.
on goods that were in short supply. But this Inflation Reduction Act, if they're spending on infrastructure, because US deficits still continue to be very high. And in
Right.
a way, since the US has spillovers to the rest of the world, their monetary policy tightening affects foreign capital volatility to the rest of the world. The sharp tightening, we're seeing a lot of fragility in the financial sector. Then it should be supported by fiscal tightening also, right? Otherwise, you have to
Right.
have more monetary tightening. So does the composition of fiscal spending make a difference? That's one set of questions. And
Right.
then, so I think this idea of using monetary and fiscal policy together, the last set of exercises, right? To whether
Mhm.
which fiscal policy alone or together, and targeting fiscal policy to the poor. That is true. But, if the targeting is done through the consumption of goods, such as food and oil or fuel, which affects the poor. But at the same time, you don't seem to talk about infrastructure spending. Because redistribution, I think redistribution, especially when say in the US, when the government debt is already, say, $31 trillion or more than that,
Right.
and if you're going to have a fiscal deficit of 7% and you're borrowing for redistributing, and other countries where debt is high, I think it's more important to restrict borrowing for redistribution. The borrowing should be only for infrastructure, the government borrowing,
Mhm. Mhm.
which would expand the supply side. And that is, I think, because in India the debt is high relative to our peers. It was about it reached 90% during COVID times, even though the spending was very marginal and targeted,
Mhm.
and but still, because income fell so steeply, the the ratios really rose. But I think we came out of it well, because over the next year, as growth recovered and because the spending was more on infrastructure, not so much on transfers, the debt ratios have already come down about 10%. And while IMF forecast for the rest of most advanced economies is that it will, especially US, China, that debt ratios will continue to rise. In India, I think, although the IMF is predicting it'll be constant, I think most of
Right.
us here feel it would fall because of higher growth and this targeted expansion in spending and a better composition of government spending. Yeah.
Right.
So let's see, and look forward to your responses, and then we'll take more questions. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this very thoughtful discussion. Actually, I agree with several of your points. I will try to go one by one. First of all, on the response of the Indian Central Bank, we have been discussing a lot, and in the introduction, even you mentioned that, but we have been discussing a lot in the fund as well, how large emerging markets Brazil and other emerging markets, they reacted first, and they actually had a better suit monetary policy to the inflationary shock than advanced economies. I think large emerging markets, they know the effects of inflation. They know how food prices and supply shocks and demand shocks transmits to their economy better sometimes than advanced economies. So they reacted first, and actually you see this effect of inflation much more prevalent and persistent in advanced economies than in large emerging markets. So I fully agree with you, and I think we indeed observed this low degree of indexation of the Indian economy, and I think the the response of the FRB, as the Indian team in the IMF has been saying, has been very very clear and very appropriate for the shock you observe. Then moving to the other questions, So I also agree that, you know, in a lot of these large emerging markets like India, like Brazil, a lot of the low income households, they do have small loans. So in Brazil, in Latin America, for example, it's very common to have like consumer loans, like you know, poor households, they have access to consumer loans, and therefore they are net borrowers, right? And therefore they are to a certain extent benefited when there is a inflationary shock or inflation surprise. The issue in a lot of these emerging markets, particularly in Latin American economies that I know better, I'm Brazilian myself, is actually like you know, this positive effect on the poor, on these net borrowers of like small consumer loans, they tend to vanish very quickly because inflation becomes persistent, and therefore, you know, their wages are not most of the time adjusted to inflation. Like the inflationary effects, they cannot like hedge themselves against like a persistent inflation. So this positive effect vanishes very quickly. So that's why in our analysis we are very careful to say this is like or distributive effects. This is for 1 year, one surprise inflationary shock, and that's the initial distributive effect that you observe in the economy. If inflation becomes more persistent, this will affect like households in a different way, because then markets and other institutions will start like changing completely. On your point of the empirical side, so separating supply versus demand shocks, we have not like in the empirical analysis, we have not differentiate between supply side inflation versus demand side inflation, okay, which is a very good comment and a very important question. So we are doing that as we speak. We are doing exercise such as that. What we do in the chapter, we have a box about like wars and inflation in the spirit of work of Thomas Sargent, for example, like these large spending programs that like boost the aggregate demand, to try to explain a little bit more that look, when there is this large like spending surge, we historically in wars, and even, you know, and we relate to the war episodes with COVID, we've seen in history these large spending surge leading to inflation, right? So you know, it's difficult to argue in the economy, for example, in the US, more clear perhaps in Europe, what is the nature of like the inflationary shock. Was it supply or is it demand? Because in the US you had a supply effect, but you also had this large spending surge, and you know, it's difficult to disentangle what is the size, and that's why we didn't do in the chapter we are doing now. But I agree with you that like a supply side inflation probably will have a different impact in terms of like inflation, in terms of like fiscal policy affecting inflation than on the other way around. Okay. Now, on the type of government spending, I fully agree with you. So the econometrics again is doing for overall increasing the fiscal deficits. It's true that the shock is identified in Valerie Rame's through news about military spending, so it's more connected to military spending, right? And military spending tends to be more connected to manufacturing than to service, for example, right? But the type of government spending, we fully agree with you, is very important to understand how this spending shock may lead to inflation. And in fact, we are doing this exercise as well now. We just wanted to say in aggregate terms, this is what happens on average, this is the effect. But clearly, you know, a large increase in public investment, you have a different effect on inflation than a large increase in, say, transfers or in like wages. of civil servants. So we are fully clear on that. So the type of government spending matters. I mean, on your discussion about like focusing on infrastructure spending, I see your point, and even in our model, so you understand, in our model, we don't have like a public investment as like a positive effect on growth. We don't have like this distinction between current spending and capital spending, right? So I'm sure that like when you have like we do this differentiation in the model, we could then analyze how public investment increase potential output and therefore may have like a different effect on inflation than the other types of spending. I just like I would cautious though by making this point that like even in a large indebted economy like the US, let's only focus on public investment and not provide transfers or support to the poor households or to the most affected by the cost of like a living crisis. That's because by doing that you are going to still increasing income inequality with like a several economic and political effects of like this increasing in income inequality. So I think the US, these countries that are heavily indebted, right, like US, China, they can consolidate in other items while protecting, I agree with you, public investment and protecting also like social programs that support the most poor. Normally, the social programs, they don't cost too much as percentage of GDP, right? They have a huge effect for this group of very low income households, right? While you can consolidate in several other areas, such as subsidies, such as like current spending on travels, on like on other like transfers and even like public wage to certain groups in the civil servants that we may have maybe less affected by this consolidation than if you don't protect these poor households, while I agree with you, you ring fence public investment. So I think in the Indian case, the Indian team has been very clear about that. I think inflation in India is much lower than in several advanced economies. Is being controlled with there was this spike last year about 6.7%, and now it's going down to around 5%. The government
it's below 5 now, yeah.
It's below 5% even, so that's a great thing.
When
so
our target range is 2 to 6, so we are within our target range now, our tolerance band.
So that's one. So the government, should keep doing their public investment as planned.
Yeah, right, absolutely, I agree with you. But this issue of protecting the poor, the question is the definition of the poor. Like
Right.
I know someone who is running an NGO in the Netherlands, and the government gave such huge payments to everybody. Now the NGO was shut, they got large checks. Now he's not poor, but with that check, his NGO is not working, he just traveled the world. And so we saw excess demand, those huge checks that went to every individual almost in the US, and it created excess demand, and it has led to this. Inflation is very different in the US. Yes, there is excess demand because households were spending so much, they had that money. And then because the US is the hegemon, the reserve currency, it creates spillovers for the entire globe. So therefore, I think the IMF must advise the US more strongly to watch out for these.
So
now the inflation and the rising interest rates are creating excess, we've seen a lot of fluctuations in the currencies. Yeah, so it is important to be, if you are going to protect the very poor, nobody is arguing about that. And you're correct, that's a very small amount given their huge deficits. But your definition of the poor is protecting everyone almost, So which creates excess demand and makes inflation persistent.
Exactly. So I think we are in the exactly the same line, and the IMF as well. We have been discussing with advanced economies, and we have been raising this point that this current inflationary shock has led to several untargeted social policies, like subsidies, like support for middle income classes that are not targets, and that's why we're seeing about targeting the very poor, right? Because of the negative effects that you just mentioned, supporting the middle class, you boost the aggregate demand, providing untargeted subsidies across the boards will, even benefit the most rich, and you're just boosting aggregate demand and keeping inflation more persistent. So in several country documents for advanced economies, we have been making this point, and I think the chapter here, we don't go in detail because it's a more analytical chapter, but I hope we are very clear that when we say support, we support the most poor and not everyone. So, and that's what
Right. Yeah,
when
and
we
when
talk
the
about
US
target.
has such a large debt, and then they are continuously increasing their deficits because they can just issue the dollar and they can finance themselves. And so, I mean, I've seen IMF saying that there's no problem borrowing for the advanced economies, the markets are there. But I mean, slowly there will be a negative effect. We are seeing that many countries are moving away from the dollar as the reserve currency. And that could lead to huge problems in global financial markets. And I think that some discipline, how do you discipline the US? So, can the IMF do it? If countries stop holding the dollar, I think it will be good for the US. They should follow more responsible policies. Yeah,
I
it
think
will
I
affect
think
the rest
we
of the world.
I think that the tone of the IMF has changed a lot about these large advanced economies in terms of fiscal support. So we have been asking our managing director, our deputy managing director has been saying how important is fiscal consolidation now in advanced economies, including the US. The director of the fiscal affairs department, Vitor, if you look at the chapter 1 on the fiscal monitor, we actually very explicitly show a chart where we show the projections of public debt increases in the US, in China, any other advanced economies, and say, look, the US is expected by 2028 to have 136% of GDP public debt.
Right. It's just
So
absurd.
I think our director has been
And
very
like we had
vocal.
a talk here with Professor Barry Eichengreen, and he was saying fiscal consolidation won't happen in the US because it's too polarized. The political parties will not red and blue will not agree. So we are seeing this debt ceiling, and again that's causing spillovers around the world. So it's and
No,
the
we fully
IMF.
agree. We fully agree. We
Hmm.
now the very latest, actually as late as yesterday, to discuss
Hmm.
the very latest conjuncture. It seems that there will be an agreement with that ceiling, and it seems that it will be connected to some sort of spending freeze. A spending freeze in a scenario of of high inflation
Hmm.
is a consolidation in real terms. So we
Hmm.
hope that even though there is this polarization, even though there is this cheap financing to keep borrowing in for the
Hmm.
U.S. economy, the U.S. government will start consolidating. The IMF has been our managing director has been very clear that now is the time to consolidate fiscal policy,
Right.
time to normalize fiscal policy, and that's one of the messages of this chapter as well, right? Let's use
Good.
fiscal policy
Hmm.
consolidation to help monetary policy and bring inflation down in advanced economies in particular.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm sure there are other. Charan, you have
Sure.
some questions. I don't see any the questions in the chat.
Yes, I do have a question, but I was wondering if Surjit Bhala is here. If he is, I think he should get a chance before
Yeah,
I.
Surjit, I
Um,
don't see him.
not. I just saw him
Surjit, are you
speaking.
there?
Okay, I'll just call him and find out because I saw he was peeping in, and then
Hmm.
suddenly I think he's vanished. Well, Marcus, this is the second time I am hearing to your presentation, and it's really wonderful. and I really think you've done a great job. I had a couple of questions. Listening to your presentation today and earlier, I was trying in my mind to think where do I position it as part of macro literature? Would it be ISLM or would it be Mundell-Fleming? Because in your equations, and of course, I don't know in detail what went behind your computations, but if you are assuming an open economy model, as Professor Ashima Goyal kept saying, that there are spillovers impacting one part of the world with the rest, with America doing what it is doing. And then it leads to series of, if not immediately, leads to series of implications over a period of time. So that comes back to bite the system. Or in that sense, if we believe in a Mundell-Fleming model and open economy model, then if the planet is considered a single growth entity, then because of these implications of high interest rates and spillovers, our production capacity, our productivity gets impacted as export demand for our goods in advanced countries will go down. So I wasn't very sure when you did the impulse response functions, what would be the lag effect, and in how much time would you think that while the Americans attempted to boost their economy by transfers, which I think was sustaining demand, it would come back to them to bite because now the exports are low, and therefore the large emerging countries or other emerging countries like Brazil, India, and their demand gets impacted, and the whole world gets into a recessionary phase. That is one thing I wasn't very clear. The other thing that was in my mind was, while you keep speaking about transfers, and in your model of deficits causing inflation, transfers are an important component. And that, to my mind, was only sustaining demand. And I think Professor Goyal mentioned it in a more explicit manner, where she said, while the system was closed and checks were being given, you were creating demand when there was absolutely no value for spending it. And therefore, it became inflationary. The third thing is, I do not know, and I couldn't figure out from your presentation, what's the time frame that you have in mind when this analysis has been conducted. So the point that I'm trying to make is, were you able to tease out the expanded balance sheets of three major central banks, Bank of England, the Euro, and the Fed Reserve? Because if you look at their balance sheets from 2008 to what they are today, they have grown 8 times. And if you look only from COVID, start of COVID, they have doubled. Now, I think there was a latent potential of a volcanic inflation, because for a very long time we kept assuming that there's a liquidity trap and the interest rates were kept very, very low for a very long time, partly what Professor Goyal mentioned, and it was waiting to happen, it just exploded. So were you able to tease out the inflationary implications of a latent high balance sheet, and then tease out what is the fiscal impact, or that exercise is yet to be done? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I see some questions on the chat. I'm also gonna answer them in a second. Let me start with you. So the model is a new Keynesian model, right? Even though there is heterogeneous agents, it's a new Keynesian model. So yeah, implicitly in the model there is some sort of a IS and LM curves in the model, right? It's not like the very simple ISLM model, but the Henk model has these ISLM, and that's like the mechanism that through which monetary policy and fiscal policy is affecting this model. So you can think it about like ISLM in a very complex way, with heterogeneous agents, with income distribution as well. Now, one thing that you mentioned that we don't have in the model, which is also important, I should have mentioned that, is that the model is a closed economy model, right? So it's not an open economy model. We calibrate the model for the US for the most recent period, right? Now, two things about that. So, or three things even. Closed economy, we think that for the US is still quite, representative. The US is to a certain extent a closed economy. Second point, we are indeed working on open economy. These models are very complex because you have 7 types of households and you have to add income distribution. There is like a endogenous effects of income distribution in the model. It becomes very, very complex to solve. That's why they are frontier models. Now the most frontier of the frontier is opening the economy. So we are actually trying to analyze now this effect of open economy. To answer your question about we are still, of course, worried in the IMF about how this global effect of inflation and what are the spillovers of monetary policy, fiscal policy in the US to other economies. So we actually have all the research. There is a presentation going right now on that, looking at in a different model that doesn't have heterogeneous agents, but have two economies. We try to understand how the increase in monetary policy and fiscal policy in a large economy may spill over to other economies, both contemporaneously, but also in terms of lags, as you said. So one question we are worried, for example, is if advanced economies all together start increasing interest rates as they have been doing, right? And given the lags of transmission of monetary policy over time, isn't this an overkill? Aren't we raising too quick, too fast, and we are gonna cause a recession in the world, much bigger recession in the world down the road because of the lags in monetary transmission? Our current research in the IMF doesn't give us these results. We still think that even though there is this combined raising interest rates in the advanced world and there is these lags, we are still in a situation where we have to raise interest rates perhaps even further, or we are at almost reaching the peak of how much interest rates have to go up, so they can control inflation, they can stabilize their economy. Stabilization of economy of these advanced economies is very important, and has huge spillovers for emerging markets. So fighting inflation is quite important, right? Now, on the balance sheets, so we look at monetary policy in a very stylized way. I fully agree, through raised interest rate in a model, right? Our econometric analysis includes, the period. It goes up to 2019. We didn't include COVID by choice because COVID is such a difficult time. We discussed COVID in a box as a situation like a war type that as you said, and we fully agree with that, in a period that there was no activity, people were lockdowns, you make a huge transfers to their households. They either save that, what they did, or they're gonna spend on a constrained economy leading to inflation. So we are fully in line with your analysis, and we actually discuss this effect in a box in our chapter, right? Now, on the balance sheets more explicitly, one thing that we discussed when we were discussing the chapter was about what about quantitative tightening? Because there is all these balance sheets. Some central banks have started to divest from the QE that they have done. This is another way to constrain monetary policy. We couldn't, we didn't analyze that in the model or empirically, but we actually mention this as another channel through which monetary policy may be affecting inflation currently, right? And we raised the point more generally, as you said, that like the increasing balance sheets and the decreasing balance sheets of central banks may have inflationary effects, right? Because in a way they are expansions or contractions of of monetary policy as well. And we don't analyze this in the chapter, but this should be analyzed going forward, right? Another to answer, moving to the questions, to answer some of the questions that are in the chart, for example, that's connected, how the monetary policy can limit being fiscally dominated. We discuss it in the chapter in two paragraphs, the situation where and the models that discuss how fiscal policy interacts with inflation when there is fiscal dominance, right? And we said we mentioned the fiscal theory price level. We mentioned how these authors discuss this interaction. We said we mentioned in the chapter that we didn't analyze that because we think that currently we still live in a world where our advanced economies have monetary dominance. We think that's difficult to believe that there are fiscal dominance, even though some authors like John Cochrane, for example, try to raise the point that the US is living in a fiscal dominance right now. We don't think so. So we analyze this effect of interaction of monetary fiscal policy in a world where monetary dominance still holds. But it's an important question. So this question about fiscally dominated, there is some research and being done, and we in the fund are looking very closely at this research done. The other question, there are two other questions in the chat. The first question is in view of the number of transfers done by central banks and state governments, do we tend to overestimate the impact of inflation?
Central and state governments. In India, we have a federal structure. So you have central transfers or policies to help the poor, as well as states provide, especially in food. There's a PDS where they get food. Throughout the COVID period, for example, food was essentially provided free to about 80% of the population. Cereals.
Right. So I fully agree. This question is an empirical question. Basically, are the programs in place in different countries actually countervailing the inflationary costs for the poorest, right? In some countries, probably they are. Perhaps in India, that's the case. In some countries, they are not. So our point in the chapter is exactly to do this type of analysis. You go to the microdata, try to understand what's going on to the different income quantiles, and then design your social program assistance and your monetary policy and fiscal overall fiscal policy in line with that. So I think that there are some places where there was too much of a support, right? There are some places that there was too little. There are many places where this support was untargeted. By targeting everyone, as we discussed before, you actually target less the poor than you should and target more other income groups than the poor. So it's an empirical question, it's an important question. And I agree that if you are doing the right level of transfers, then yes, the poor is not going to be the most impacted, but one has to analyze that with data, right? And then the third question that I see here in the chat is what are the ways in which monetary and fiscal policy coordination could be improved? We are making several analyses along these lines now. I think that both, the communication of monetary policy and fiscal policy could be better coordinated, right? Not only the policies, but so right now you observe that perhaps in some countries like the US, monetary policy and fiscal policy are not coordinating because fiscal policy is still expansionary and while monetary policy is trying to contract, right? But beyond that, even in some countries where you do have like both policies in the same direction, if you don't communicate that well, you are losing part of this effect. Part of like the effect that fiscal policy in our director, Vitor Gaspar, make these points all the time. Part of the way that like fiscal policy can support monetary policy is by bringing credibility for the entire system. A lot of like inflation goes through inflation expectations. So if like the fiscal authorities, if the government announces fiscal consolidation, announces that like is trying to coordinate with monetary policy to fight inflation, probably the individuals, the households, they will integrate that in their expectation formation, and probably the effects on the inflation will be lower than without that communication, even though both policies are moving in the right direction. So that's one way to improve coordination of monetary fiscal policy. There are other ways, for example, in the establishment of public wages. And that's one question that we are trying to address, and one question that's important to think about. When establishing public wages, should governments be looking at like the level of the inflation target as the value to adjust the public wage, that would anchor automatically the public wage, the government spending, to the inflation targets? Should governments look at like inflation expectation levels instead of like past inflation when making their adjustments to public wage? These are type of questions that like are important and talk to this issue about coordination between monetary and fiscal policy. Okay? There is a final question. Because of fiscal dominance, there is a poor monetary policy transmission to the real economy. How to improve it? So again, it depends on which country the questioner is asking about. In advanced economies, we don't believe there is fiscal dominance, right? But in many other countries, there may be fiscal dominance. Monetary policy transmission is very important, right? And particular for emerging markets, particular for low-income countries. So in these economies, like to improve the monetary policy transmission, I think having a more like diversified and like a developed financial system will help a lot on improving monetary policy transmission. Having a credible monetary policy, a credible monetary system will help improving the monetary policy transmission. Having a credible fiscal policy as well may also help in the monetary policy transmission. So I agree that like fiscal dominance may affect monetary transmission, and it's important to address institutional factors for this monetary transmission as well as the fiscal dominance.
I think even in emerging markets, once you are open to foreign inflows and so on, then there is monetary policy gains much more independence. It becomes dominant because the fiscal, you're worried about high borrowing costs, etc. And so that tends to discipline the fisc. But I think the issue of coordination of monetary and fiscal policy is very different under supply shocks. So when you take that independence, central bank independence route, that's essential for independence, and the two should not coordinate in public, etc. But we found that this coordination worked very well in the current governor. Before that, they were really at loggerheads and the economy did much worse. But during the pandemic period, because the government was working on the supply side, on oil, on food, on generally structural, reducing bottlenecks, etc. So I was in the monetary policy committee through this period, and the fact that the government is acting on reducing inflation gave us some freedom not to raise rates as much as we would otherwise have had to do, and helped the economy recover faster. So,
Exactly.
you have to look at all those aspects. One final issue I wanted to raise about this international political economy, that which contraction or tightening, if the US is the dominant economy and is responsible for a lot of the spillovers to the rest of the world, capital flows and so on. We saw as soon as the Fed started tightening, it raises from 0 to 5, and there was tremendous pressure on us to raise rates, even though you just come out of a pandemic and you needed to
Right.
help the recovery also, because there are outflows. So India did well because we did self-insurance, we had reserves, we could smooth those shocks and so on. So,
Right.
like as a IMF, if you're advising and you want to minimize global spillovers, would tightening fiscal consolidation have less spillovers in the rest of the world compared to monetary tightening in the US? If there's monetary overreaction, like you say, the IMF has your research shows that it's very important to tighten monetary policy to prevent future inflation, which can create more spillovers to the rest of the world. But we found, for example, that if you keep on, like the Fed has been saying, that as long as inflation is above our target, we will tighten. Now, because of lags in monetary policy, that's a recipe for overshooting. And it keeps markets on tenterhooks. The dollar strengthens, the outflows from elsewhere, and so on. So it's better to, and if there's more fiscal consolidation, then the monetary, obviously, if the US is going to continue running 7% fiscal deficit, monetary policy has to tighten more, no? Because if fiscal spending is still stimulating the economy, but monetary tightening creates more, affects capital flows and outflows from emerging markets. So therefore, if you are responsible as a hegemon, you should be. You should think of the combination which creates the least international spillovers.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. No, we fully agree. Again, that's part of the research as I was mentioning, like spillover effects of this interaction of monetary and fiscal policy to other emerging markets. I think, the initial research has already shown that this monetary spillover is much faster, like the mechanism, right, through capital flows, through several other effects on these emerging markets economies. Fiscal policy may also have an effect, but there is a mix that should be listed affected, and this mix should be thought both in terms of the spillovers to the outside world, but also in terms of that sustainability for
absolutely. Because
its own
as Dr. Charan Singh was saying, now emerging markets account for more than 50% of global growth. And so if the US, the Fed's mandate is only domestic growth and inflation, okay, if that is the mandate, but domestic growth will be affected if, like we know that through the 2010s after the global financial crisis, emerging markets grew much more slowly than the previous decade. And this affects global growth, and US growth. So, yeah.
I think we are fully in line. It's quite important. We are also looking very carefully now. We are also trying to understand what type of precise instruments in terms of fiscal tightening should we increase taxation? Should we cut spending? Would reduce more inflation, or they reduce faster inflation while not harming so much growth, or not harming so much the spillover effects to other economies. There is a recent paper from the American Economic Review showing how some types of taxation, particular taxation on households and consumption, not on corporate, have a positive effect in reducing inflation. So there's a lot of research. The researchers trying to understand what type of fiscal instruments and how fiscal policy can, play its role on this policy mix to reduce inflation, but also reduce, which I fully agree is a cause for concern, the spillovers of this contraction in the rest of the world.
Right. Okay, thank you. I think we've exceeded our time by 5 minutes. So it's been a very interesting discussion.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and like thank
I'll
you for the
hand over to
invitation.
Dr. Singh. He wants to make some closing
Yeah, I
remarks.
just want, I have to make some important announcements. But before that, I'm so tempted to ask you, Marcos, when Olivier Blanket was there at the IMF, he did mention about what is this inflation target? Is 2% right? Should it be 4%? I think there is need for, when you've done such an extensive research on everything pivoted on inflation, I think the question of what is the right inflation target, should it be 2? Should it be 4? Should it be different for different countries without feeling
Right.
guilty about it? I think that needs to be re-looked at. The other thing is, I'm not very sure if your research has looked in, there are countries, for some time, even in India, there was monetized part of the deficit, which was also very inflationary. And we suffered from that loophole from 1951 to 1993. So
Right.
I do not know in your research if you've come across a country which also has that monetized deficit part of the gross fiscal deficit. That would automatically be causing inflationary impact. Okay, so I must thank Marcos for being with us early in the morning, and to Professor Goyal. I know how busy she was. Now she made it a point to come and chair this just in time, I would say,
Thank
to
you so
agree
much.
to our request and chair this important session. So I must thank Professor Goyal too, and the participants who have asked such interesting questions and made the discussion so interesting. Marcos, I must thank you for your detailed answers. You took time to answer each one of us, and so happy that good amount of research is continuing at the IIM. Next week, by the way, today's webinar will be available on our website, the recording, by noon tomorrow, and I'm sure we'll be using it extensively for different purposes. The next webinar on Friday next week is by Professor Galina. She is from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and she is going to be talking to us about FDI. So I'd invite all of you to please join us next week. And the week after, we are having a special session on India at 2047. But the special session is on empowering women for developed India at 2047. So I'd invite all of you to please pencil for the timings next week and a week after that. Once again,
Right.
thanks to all of you. Bye.
Thank you. EGROW is doing
Thank
a
you
great
so
job.
much.
These Friday discussions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Marcos.
Thank you.